My name is Arthur. I spent 40 years teaching physics to high school students in Portland before retiring. At 68, I never imagined my own son Daniel would betray me by emptying our family's entire life savings of $325,000. He vanished with his girlfriend Melanie, a woman who turned out to be a professional scammer. I was completely devastated until my 13-year-old grandson, Jake, looked at me with those bright, determined eyes and said, "Grandpa, don't worry. I can handle this." I had no idea those words would change everything. Where are you watching from today? If you've ever experienced betrayal from someone you trusted or been amazed by the wisdom of younger generations, hit subscribe and join us. Family may hurt us deeply, but sometimes healing comes from the most unexpected places. I retired from teaching 6 years ago, the same year I lost my wife, Margaret, to a heart condition. We'd been married for 42 years, and I thought that would be the hardest thing I'd ever endure. Margaret and I had lived modestly throughout our careers. We saved diligently, invested conservatively, and managed to pay off our small 3-bedroom house in a quiet Portland neighborhood. Nothing fancy, but it was ours. Between my teacher's pension, Social Security, and our retirement accounts, I had enough to live comfortably without financial worries. That was the plan anyway. Our son Daniel was always bright but troubled. Even as a child, he struggled with authority and making sensible decisions. In high school, he could solve complex calculus problems effortlessly, but couldn't seem to understand why skipping class to play video games was a bad idea. Margaret always said he had too much intelligence and not enough wisdom. How right she was. Daniel's adult years were marked by a series of financial disasters. At 24, he convinced me to help fund his first business venture, a sports memorabilia shop that closed within 8 months. At 30, he called at midnight, needing $15,000 to pay off gambling debts to some guys who don't mess around. At 35, he needed a co-signer for a car loan after defaulting on his previous one. Each time, Margaret and I would discuss, worry, argue, and ultimately help him. We couldn't bear to see him suffer, even when the suffering was self-inflicted. 5 years ago, Daniel's marriage to Lisa fell apart. They had one child, my grandson Jake, who was 8 at the time. The divorce was messy, primarily due to Daniel's financial irresponsibility and emotional immaturity. Lisa received primary custody, with Daniel having visitation every other weekend. Since Daniel's apartment wasn't really suitable for a child, and he often worked weekends as a sales representative for various companies, Jake started spending his dad weekends with me instead. What began as a practical arrangement became the brightest spot in my retirement years. Jake was exceptional from an early age. While Daniel had raw intelligence but no focus, Jake combined intelligence with curiosity and determination. By 10, he was building his own computers from parts. By 11, he was writing simple programs and competing in coding competitions. Now, at 13, he was frequently helping teachers with technical problems at school. He reminded me of Margaret with his practical approach to problems and quiet observation skills. Our weekends fell into a comfortable routine. Jake would arrive on Friday afternoon, and we'd make homemade pizza while catching up on his week. Saturdays were for projects, sometimes science experiments I'd saved from my teaching days, sometimes computer builds or coding challenges Jake was working on. Sundays often involved strategy board games and preparing for the week ahead. Throughout it all, we talked about school friends, science, and occasionally about his father. 8 months ago, Daniel called to ask if he could bring someone to Sunday dinner. "Her name is Melanie," he said, sounding more excited than I'd heard in years. "She's amazing, Dad. I think this is really serious." Melanie turned out to be a striking woman in her late 20s at least 15 years younger than Daniel. She arrived wearing designer clothes and speaking with what seemed to be a slight European accent. Over dinner, she shared an elaborate background fashion industry experience in Milan education at prestigious European schools, connections to various celebrities I'd heard of. She was charming, attentive, and made Daniel beam with every glance in his direction. Something felt off to me, though I couldn't place it exactly. Perhaps it was the way her stories sometimes contained small contradictions, or how she deflected certain questions about her family. When I asked which design house she'd worked for in Milan, she mentioned a name I'd never heard of, then quickly changed the subject to compliment Margaret's china, which I'd used for the occasion. Daniel was clearly infatuated. He laughed too loudly at her jokes and kept touching her arm or shoulder, as if reassuring himself she was really there. When Jake asked direct questions about her work, Daniel often answered for her. After they left, Jake looked at me seriously. Her accent changed 3 times during dinner, Grandpa. I dismissed his observation, not wanting to seem judgmental about Daniel's first serious relationship since his divorce. People's accents can vary, Jake, especially if they've lived in different countries. Jake shrugged. If you say so. But I don't think she went to fashion school either. I should have listened more carefully to my grandson that day. It would have saved us all a great deal of pain in the months to come. Over the next 6 months, Daniel and Melanie became regular visitors. What started as occasional Sunday dinners evolved into multiple weekly visits. I was initially pleased to see more of my son, but something about the increased frequency felt calculated rather than affectionate. Melanie seemed particularly interested in my financial situation, though she disguised her curiosity as casual conversation. "Arthur, you have such a lovely home. Do you have a mortgage still?" she asked during one visit. Another time, "With the market being so volatile, where do you keep your retirement funds? Daniel says you were always such a careful planner." I answered these questions honestly, seeing no reason for suspicion. I explained how Margaret and I had paid off our mortgage 10 years earlier, how my pension worked, and how our savings were divided among various accounts and investments. During their 4th visit, I overheard Melanie on the phone in the backyard. She was speaking with no accent whatsoever, using phrases and slang that contradicted her sophisticated European persona. When she noticed me watering plants nearby, she quickly ended the call and resumed her accented speech when addressing me. Jake noticed far more than I did. "She's fake Grandpa," he told me bluntly after they left one evening. "Nobody who actually went to those schools would make the mistakes she does. That's not very charitable," I replied, though doubt had begun to creep in. "People exaggerate their backgrounds sometimes. It doesn't make them bad people." "She went through your mail when you were showing Dad your new grill," Jake continued. "I saw her from the upstairs window." I dismissed his concerns again, not wanting to create tension with Daniel, who seemed happier than he had in years. "You must have misunderstood what you saw," I told Jake. "Let's give her the benefit of the doubt." 3 months into their relationship, Daniel announced a business opportunity that required investment. He was vague about details but enthusiastic about potential returns. "It's import-export," he explained over dinner. "Melanie has connections in Europe who can supply luxury goods at wholesale prices. We just need startup capital to place the first orders." I expressed concern about the lack of a formal business plan. "Have you researched the market? Created financial projections? Consulted with a business attorney?" Daniel became defensive immediately. "Not everything needs spreadsheets and lawyers, Dad. Sometimes you have to trust your instincts. Melanie's been in this industry for years." Melanie smoothly interjected, "Arthur, I understand your caution. It's admirable. But this opportunity won't last long. We need to move quickly." The conversation deteriorated from there. Daniel accused me of never believing in him, while I maintained that asking basic questions wasn't the same as withholding support. We ended the evening on tense terms, with Daniel and Melanie leaving earlier than planned. After that dinner, Daniel's visits became less frequent, though he began calling with requests for small loans with increasing regularity. $2,000 for car repairs, $1,500 for medical expenses not covered by insurance, $3,000 for an apartment security deposit when they decided to move in together. I confided my concerns to my neighbor and friend Howard, a retired bank manager who had known our family for decades. "Something doesn't add up with this woman," I told him during our weekly coffee meetup. "But Daniel's so defensive, I can't even ask questions." Howard suggested hiring a private investigator. "Better to be embarrassed if you're wrong than defrauded if you're right," he said. I declined, worried about irreparably damaging my relationship with Daniel if he discovered I was investigating his girlfriend. That decision would soon prove to be a costly mistake. In October, I hosted a family dinner and invited Daniel's ex-wife, Lisa, as we had maintained a cordial relationship for Jake's sake. Melanie spent the evening charming everyone, sharing stories about her supposed travels and career. During dessert, she mentioned having met Margaret's brother in London years earlier. "Such a distinguished gentleman," she said, smiling at me. Margaret must have adored him. The room went silent. Lisa looked at her plate uncomfortably. Jake stared at Melanie with undisguised suspicion. "My wife was an only child," I said quietly. Melanie recovered quickly. "Oh, I must have misunderstood Daniel. Perhaps it was a close friend he mentioned." Later that week, I found Melanie in my home office when she was supposedly using the bathroom. She claimed to have gotten lost, though she'd been to my house numerous times by then. When I mentioned the incident to Daniel privately, he exploded. "For God's sake, Dad, are you actually accusing Melanie of snooping? She took a wrong turn in the hallway. Are you getting paranoid in your old age?" By Thanksgiving, I was deeply concerned about the relationship, but had no concrete evidence of anything beyond exaggeration and perhaps opportunism. I had no idea that the situation was far worse than I imagined, or that the holiday would mark the beginning of the most painful chapter of my life. I'd planned an elaborate Thanksgiving dinner using many of Margaret's recipes from the handwritten cookbook she'd left behind. Jake was scheduled to stay for an extended 5-day visit, while Daniel and Melanie were supposed to arrive on Thanksgiving morning to help with preparations. The day before Thanksgiving, Daniel called with an excuse about a work emergency, requiring his immediate attention in Seattle. "We'll have to come on Friday instead," he said, sounding harried. "Some client crisis Melanie's helping me navigate." I was disappointed, but understood that work obligations sometimes couldn't be avoided. Jake arrived as planned, and we spent Wednesday preparing side dishes and setting the table with Margaret's good china, even though our dinner party would be smaller than anticipated. On Thanksgiving morning, while Jake and I were preparing the turkey, I received a call from First Regional Bank asking to verify several large withdrawals from my accounts. "We've noticed unusual activity," the representative explained. "There have been multiple transfers over the past 48 hours, totaling over $300,000. Did you authorize these transactions?" My blood ran cold. "Absolutely not," I said, gripping the kitchen counter for support. "I haven't made any large transfers." The representative explained that the transactions had been initiated through online banking, using my correct login credentials, and had passed all security verifications, including answers to my security questions. "We'll need you to come to the branch immediately to fill out fraud paperwork," she said. "In the meantime, we'll place a freeze on all your accounts." I stood in shock, trying to process what I was hearing. Jake looked up from the cutting board, concern etched on his face. "Grandpa, what's wrong?" I couldn't bring myself to explain just yet. "I need to go to the bank. Something's wrong with my accounts." Jake insisted on coming with me. During the tense drive to the bank, I tried calling Daniel repeatedly, but each call went straight to voicemail. A creeping suspicion began forming, but I pushed it away. My son wouldn't do this. He couldn't. At the bank, the full extent of the theft became clear. Someone had systematically emptied my accounts over the previous 2 days. My retirement savings, $325,000, representing decades of careful planning with Margaret, had been transferred to accounts I didn't recognize. The bank manager showed me the transaction records, pointing out that all security protocols had been correctly navigated. Whoever did this had access to your personal information, he explained gently. They knew your mother's maiden name, your first pet's name, the street you grew up on. All information Danielle would know. The timing suddenly made terrible sense. The invented work emergency, the postponed Thanksgiving visit. I felt physically ill as I filed the police report at the bank manager's urging. The responding officer was sympathetic, but not optimistic. Because the transfers were made using correct credentials and security information. This will be complicated to prosecute, he explained, especially if it was a family member with authorized access to your home. I provided Daniel and Melanie's information, and the officer made a call to run a background check. His expression changed as he received information over his radio. Sir, the woman you know as Melanie Richards is actually Catherine Dawson. She has multiple aliases and has been investigated for similar scams in 3 states. She typically targets older men through their adult children. The officer explained the pattern. Catherine would begin relationships with financially unstable men who had wealthy parents. She would gain their trust, encourage them to estrange from suspicious family members, and eventually manipulate them into participating in theft, convincing them they deserved the money or would pay it back after their business venture succeeded. By the time we returned home, I felt hollowed out. My hands shook as I inserted the key into the lock. Jake had been quietly observant throughout the ordeal, asking thoughtful questions of the bank manager and police officer. Daniel and Melanie took all my money, I finally explained to Jake as we sat at the kitchen table, our Thanksgiving preparations abandoned. Everything Grandma and I saved. I expected tears or confusion from a 13-year-old faced with adult betrayal. Instead, Jake nodded thoughtfully and said, "Don't worry, Grandpa. I can handle this." I barely registered his response, dismissing it as a child's attempt at comfort. I spent that night alternating between rage and despair, wondering how I would manage without my savings, feeling the double blow of financial devastation and filial betrayal. Meanwhile, Jake sat quietly at his computer, occasionally making notes, his face illuminated by the screen's blue light as I drifted in and out of restless sleep. I woke the next morning to find Jake still at his computer, surrounded by notebooks filled with diagrams and lists. His eyes were red-rimmed from lack of sleep, but he looked strangely energized. "I found them," he announced when he saw I was awake. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my head pounding from stress and inadequate rest. "Dad and Melanie, or Catherine, I guess. I know where they are and how they moved the money." I sighed heavily, not wanting to dampen his enthusiasm, but needing to be realistic. "Jake, these are professional scammers. The police said they've done this before and gotten away with it. This isn't something a 13-year-old can solve." Jake turned his laptop toward me. "I've been suspicious of her for months, Grandpa. I've been collecting data since that first dinner when her accent kept changing." He showed me a spreadsheet documenting inconsistencies in Melanie's stories, dates she'd accessed our home computer, and search histories she hadn't properly cleared. He had screenshots of social media profiles under various names that used the same photographs. "She's not as clever as she thinks," Jake said. "She uses variations of the same passwords across accounts and leaves digital breadcrumbs everywhere." I remembered the state coding competition Jake had won the previous year, where he had impressed judges with his ability to identify patterns in seemingly random data. Still, this seemed beyond even his considerable talents. "Even if you found something, we should leave this to the authorities," I said. Jake shook his head firmly. "The police officer said prosecution would be difficult because of how they accessed the accounts. We need to track them ourselves and get proof of their intentions." Reluctantly, I agreed to listen to Jake's plan before contacting the authorities again. He explained that Catherine had a pattern in her previous scams, typically targeting men with similar profiles and using consistent methods to move stolen money through a series of accounts before eventually transferring funds overseas. He had already discovered Daniel's new phone number by accessing connected accounts from Daniel's old laptop, which was still in my guest room. When we tried calling, the call went to voicemail, but Jake recorded the message and isolated background sounds. "That's a specific type of ferry horn," he explained, playing back the enhanced audio. "And those bird calls are western gulls common along the Pacific Northwest coast." My neighbor Howard arrived that afternoon, having noticed my car was gone on Thanksgiving. When I explained what had happened, he was appalled but impressed by Jake's methodical approach. "I worked in banking security for years before management," Howard told me. "This kid's got the right instincts." We formed an unlikely team. Jake with his technical skills, Howard with his banking knowledge, and me with my systematic scientific approach to problem solving. Jake accessed Daniel's cloud accounts using password recovery methods that exploited Daniel's habit of using the same security answers across platforms. "Look," Jake said that evening, showing us recently uploaded photos with location data still embedded. "These were taken yesterday at Cape Meridian, about 300 miles up the coast." "Should we be doing this?" I asked, concerned about the ethics and legality of our investigation. "We're not hacking," Jake explained. "We're using legitimate recovery methods on accounts Dad previously accessed from this house and looking at public information. We're compiling evidence for the police, not taking action ourselves." That night, Jake made his first major breakthrough. They're staying at the Oceanside Inn under Catherine's real name. She booked it 2 weeks ago. For the first time since discovering the theft, I felt a glimmer of hope. My grandson was proving to be more resourceful than I could have imagined. By day 3 of our investigation, we had transformed my dining room into what Howard called our war room. Maps, printouts, and timeline charts covered the walls. Jake had barely slept, subsisting on sandwiches and energy drinks, despite my concerns about caffeine for a teenager. Howard's banking experience proved invaluable as he helped identify transaction patterns in the stolen funds. Catherine had moved the money through a series of newly created accounts, each transfer designed to obscure the origin of the funds. "She's preparing for international transfers," Howard explained, pointing to transaction codes. "These preparations typically precede moving money overseas, where recovery becomes nearly impossible." I struggled to remain objective as we analyzed evidence of my son's betrayal. Each new discovery was like a fresh wound. Text messages showing Daniel had known about the plan for weeks, emails discussing what they would tell police if questioned, browsed web pages about countries without extradition treaties. A detective assigned to our case visited on the 3rd day. Initially skeptical of our amateur investigation, his attitude changed as Jake methodically walked him through the evidence we'd gathered. "This is more than we had," he admitted, "but proving intent is still difficult. They could claim Daniel had permission to access the accounts." Jake had anticipated this obstacle. "That's why I created digital tripwires," he explained, showing the detective how he had set up notifications that would alert us when any of Daniel's known devices accessed certain online platforms. "They'll make mistakes," Jake said with the confidence of someone twice his age. "People stick to patterns, especially when they think they've gotten away with something." That afternoon, Jake's preparation paid off. One of his tripwires triggered, alerting us that someone had attempted to open a new account using a scan of Daniel's driver's license. Jake tracked the application to an IP address at their hotel. The detective used this information to freeze the new account before money could be transferred, recovering $42,000 of my savings. Though a small fraction of what was taken, it represented our first concrete victory. Jake's digital investigation expanded to social media, where he identified patterns in Catherine's previous activities. By searching public records and cross-referencing with social media connections, he found another victim from 6 months earlier, a retired doctor whose son had also fallen under Catherine's influence. With the detective's permission, I contacted this previous victim, who provided valuable insights into Catherine's methods and weaknesses. She keeps a secure digital vault with incriminating information about her partners, the doctor told me. Insurance to make sure they don't turn on her. In my son's case, she had recordings of him discussing the plan to access my accounts. Armed with this information, Jake created what he called Digital Bait, a fake login portal designed to capture Catherine's access credentials if she attempted to use it. I was concerned about crossing legal boundaries, but the detective assured us that our methods remained within acceptable limits for evidence gathering, as long as we continued coordinating with law enforcement. As we worked, I found myself constantly amazed by Jake's capabilities, but also troubled by the role reversal. A 13-year-old shouldn't have to rescue his grandfather from financial ruin or track his father's criminal activities. During a quiet moment while Howard was meeting with bank representatives, I shared this concern with Jake. "I don't want this responsibility to be on your shoulders," I told him. "You're still a child." Jake looked at me with an expression that seemed far older than his years. "Dad has been taking advantage of people for a long time, Grandpa. Mom and I suffered too. He borrowed all her savings for a business opportunity right before the divorce." This revelation gave me new insight into why Jake had been so immediately suspicious of Catherine/Melanie. He had already witnessed his father's financial manipulation up close. After a week of intensive investigation, we provided the detective with a comprehensive report showing the money trail communication patterns and evidence of premeditation. The most damning discovery came when Jake found evidence that Catherine was already setting up her next scam with social media messages to potential new targets that followed the exact pattern she had used with Daniel. "She's planning to leave him," Jake explained, showing me messages where Catherine had begun creating a narrative that Daniel had acted alone in stealing the money. "She's setting him up to take all the blame." Despite everything Daniel had done, I couldn't bear the thought of my son being manipulated into taking sole responsibility for Catherine's orchestrated scheme. Our focus shifted to not only recovering what funds we could, but also gathering evidence that might mitigate Daniel's legal consequences by proving Catherine's predatory pattern. After 10 days of investigation, we had assembled enough evidence for direct action. Jake created a secure communication channel that couldn't be traced back to our location, and we sent Daniel a carefully worded message that included just enough information to prove we knew where they were and what they had done. The response came within minutes, panicked and defensive. Daniel claimed Catherine had manipulated him, that he had intended to return the money after their investment paid off, that he was sorry but it wasn't entirely his fault. I felt a complex mixture of emotions reading his words. Anger at the betrayal, pain at his weakness, but also a father's instinctive concern for a child in trouble, even when that child was 42 years old. Catherine's message followed shortly after, far more threatening in tone. She warned that any attempts to recover the money would result in Daniel facing criminal charges, implying she had evidence that would incriminate him while protecting herself. Jake tracked the access location from both responses, confirming they were still at the coastal resort. After consulting with the detective, we decided police involvement was essential for the confrontation, particularly given Catherine's history of threatening behavior toward previous victims who had tried to recover stolen funds. The detective arranged for local police to coordinate with us, while Howard stayed behind to monitor digital activity and alert us to any attempts to move the remaining money. Jake insisted on coming, despite my reservations about bringing him into a potentially volatile situation. "I've done all the tracking work," he argued. "I understand their patterns better than anyone. If they try something technical to escape, you'll need me there." The 3-hour drive to Cape Meridian gave me time to reflect on the catastrophic breakdown of trust with my son. Had I missed warning signs in his childhood? Could I have guided him toward better choices? The weight of these questions sat heavily on my chest as coastal scenery flashed past the car windows. Jake maintained constant surveillance of their digital footprint during our journey, monitoring credit card activity and login attempts that might indicate they suspected our approach. "They ordered room service 20 minutes ago," he reported. "They're still in the hotel." We arrived in the small resort town just before noon. After checking in with local police, we established surveillance of the oceanfront hotel from a cafe across the street. The detective coordinated with hotel security to ensure all exits were monitored. Just after 1 o'clock, we spotted Daniel alone in the hotel restaurant, seated at a window table. He looked different, hair dyed darker, wearing glasses I'd never seen before, constantly glancing at his phone. Catherine's absence from the table presented an opportunity for isolated contact. The detective suggested approaching Daniel while police officers waited nearby, hoping he might be more forthcoming without Catherine's influence. With a detective positioned at the restaurant entrance and another watching the hotel's main exit, I walked across the street, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. Through the restaurant window, I saw the exact moment Daniel noticed me, the color draining from his face, the fork freezing halfway to his mouth, the look of a cornered animal. I sat down across from him, without waiting for an invitation. "Hello, Daniel." He glanced frantically toward the exits. "Dad, I can explain." "I think you should," I said, keeping my voice steady, despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm me. "You stole my life savings, everything your mother and I worked for over 40 years. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. "She said we would triple the money, a guaranteed investment opportunity. When I realized it was a scam, it was too late. She has dirt on me now. Recordings of me agreeing to everything." As Daniel spoke, I saw Catherine entering the restaurant. She spotted us immediately, her practiced smile faltering for just a moment before she turned and walked briskly toward the exit. "Catherine Dawson," the detective said, stepping into her path. "We need to speak with you about some financial irregularities." Catherine attempted to leave through another exit, but Jake's digital trap activated. He had coordinated with hotel security to ensure all key card-controlled doors would trigger an alert when Catherine's room key was used. Police intercepted her at the service entrance, where she had tried to exit after her key card set off silent alarms. When officers searched her purse, they found a plane ticket to Mexico in only her name scheduled for the following day, along with multiple identity documents with different names, but her photograph. Daniel watched the arrest with a mixture of shock and devastation, finally understanding he had never been her partner, only her next victim. "She was going to leave me," he whispered. "After everything I did for her." His face crumpled as the reality of his situation sank in. He had betrayed his family, committed financial fraud, and would likely face criminal charges, all for someone who had planned to abandon him once she had what she wanted. The most powerful moment came when Daniel realized Jake had orchestrated the tracking operation. As police officers explained how they had located them, Daniel stared at his son with disbelief. "Jake figured it out," I explained. "He tracked your digital footprint, found your accounts, set up the alerts that led us here. He's the reason we found you before all the money disappeared overseas." Daniel covered his face with his hands. "My 13-year-old son," he murmured. "I'm being arrested because my 13-year-old son outsmarted me." In the hotel room that evening under police supervision, Daniel explained how the manipulation had occurred over months. Catherine had isolated him from friends who asked too many questions, flattered his ego with promises of wealth and status, and gradually convinced him that his financial struggles were the result of his family never giving him a fair chance. "She made it sound reasonable," he said, his voice hollow. "Like I deserved that money more than you did, because I had so many opportunities taken from me. She had an answer for every doubt, a justification for every step." Jake presented a timeline showing Catherine's calculated approach, how she had researched our family before ever coincidentally meeting Daniel, how she had systematically gathered financial information during each visit to our home, how she had created emotional distance between Daniel and me to prevent him from having second thoughts. The evidence Jake had compiled was comprehensive enough that the detective believed it would support charges not just for the theft of my savings, but for multiple previous scams Catherine had conducted across state lines. As Daniel was taken into custody, I found myself torn between justice and mercy. My son had committed a terrible betrayal, but he had also fallen victim to a practiced predator who had exploited his weaknesses with calculated precision. The most difficult decision lay ahead: how much to fight for Daniel's legal protection while still holding him accountable for his choices. The weeks following the arrests were a chaotic blur of legal consultations, financial paperwork, and emotional processing. Daniel remained in custody, cooperating with authorities in exchange for consideration during sentencing. Catherine faced multiple felony charges from several jurisdictions, with our case adding to an already substantial list of fraud allegations. We returned home to the practical reality of my diminished financial situation. Of the $325,000 taken, we had recovered just under $90,000 through frozen accounts and funds seized during the arrest. The remainder had been transferred through too many channels to track effectively, or had been spent on luxury hotel stays, expensive restaurants and shopping sprees during the weeks before we caught up to them. I met with financial advisors to restructure my retirement plans, accepting that I would need to live more frugally than anticipated and possibly work part-time to supplement my pension. The adjustment was difficult but manageable. The emotional wounds proved harder to heal than the financial ones. Jake returned to his regular schedule of school and extracurricular activities, though he continued monitoring recovery efforts and corresponding with the cybercrime division that had become involved in Catherine's case. His teachers noticed a new intensity in his focus on computer security topics, and his school counselor contacted Lisa to ensure he was processing the traumatic family events appropriately. Daniel's legal situation evolved as investigations revealed more about Catherine's methods. Evidence from her digital vault confirmed that she had recorded conversations manipulating Daniel into the theft, supporting his claim of being influenced by a practiced con artist. While this didn't absolve him of responsibility, it did provide context that his attorney used to negotiate a plea agreement. The terms required full restitution of the stolen funds, 2 years in a minimum security facility, and 3 years of probation with mandatory financial counseling and addiction treatment. The gambling problem Daniel had hidden for years came to light during psychological evaluation, explaining much of his financial desperation that had made him vulnerable to Catherine's manipulation. 3 months after the arrest, we established a family therapy regimen that included Daniel via video from detention, Jake, Lisa, and me. These difficult sessions revealed years of dysfunctional patterns I had enabled through well-intentioned but misguided attempts to shield Daniel from consequences. Every time you bailed him out, the therapist explained during one session, you reinforced the idea that he didn't need to develop financial responsibility. Your protection became a form of harm. These insights were painful, but necessary. I had to acknowledge my role in creating the conditions that made Daniel susceptible to someone like Catherine. 6 months after the theft, we held a family dinner that included Lisa for the first time since the divorce. Jake had requested this gathering, feeling it was important to begin rebuilding family connections that had been damaged long before Catherine entered our lives. "I don't want us to be defined by what happened," he said with remarkable wisdom for his age. "Dad made terrible choices, but he's still my father. We need to find a way forward." Lisa had every reason to be bitter. Daniel had borrowed heavily from her before their divorce and never repaid those debts. Yet she showed remarkable grace. "Jake needs to see that adults can make mistakes, take responsibility, and be forgiven," she explained to me privately. "Otherwise, what are we teaching him about redemption?" As the 1-year anniversary of the theft approached, our circumstances had evolved significantly. I had adjusted to my modified retirement, finding unexpected satisfaction in part-time work as a science enrichment teacher at a local community center. Daniel had completed financial rehabilitation programs in custody and maintained weekly video calls with Jake, their relationship slowly mending through honest conversation. The most significant transformation, however, was in Jake. His role in resolving the crisis had given him direction and purpose. With my encouragement, he had joined a cybersecurity program for gifted teens, where his talents were being channeled toward ethical hacking and security system development. "I want to help people like you, Grandpa," he told me. "Older people who don't understand how vulnerable they are online." From the recovered funds, I established a college account for Jake, ensuring that Catherine's actions wouldn't compromise his educational future. The detective who had worked with us nominated Jake for a Civilian Recognition Award from the Cybercrime Division, resulting in a commendation ceremony that filled me with immeasurable pride. Daniel's release from custody marked another milestone in our healing journey. His first act as a free man was to sign a legally binding restitution agreement, committing 40% of his future income toward repaying what remained of the stolen funds. He accepted a job at a construction company owned by Howard's son-in-law, modest work compared to his previous sales positions, but stable employment that accommodated his probation requirements. We established new family traditions to rebuild trust, including weekly transparency meetings where financial decisions were discussed openly. Daniel shared his struggles with gambling addiction, attending regular support groups, and maintaining strict accountability for his spending through a monitored account system. A year and a half after the theft, I had regained financial stability through careful planning and the partial recovery of funds. My retirement looked different than originally envisioned, but not necessarily worse. I found genuine fulfillment in teaching science to seniors at the community center, helping them understand and protect themselves in the digital world. Jake's interest in cybersecurity blossomed into what clearly looked like a future career path. The local police department's cybercrime unit occasionally consulted him on cases involving teenage victims or perpetrators, valuing his insight into how young people navigated digital spaces. During a fishing trip that had become our monthly tradition, Jake finally explained what had initially made him suspicious of Catherine. "She used the same techniques on Dad that scammers use in MMORPGs, massive multiplayer online games," he explained as we sat on the dock. "Love bombing, creating artificial scarcity, building false urgency around decisions. I recognize the pattern from gaming forums where they warn about emotional manipulation tactics. I marveled at how knowledge from what I had considered mere recreational gaming had equipped my grandson to recognize a threat I had completely missed despite decades more life experience." "You know what the real difference between Dad and me is?" Jake asked thoughtfully. He never learned that it's okay to ask for help when you don't know something. He always had to pretend he knew everything, even when he didn't have a clue. That insight perfectly crystallized what I had failed to teach my son, despite my years as an educator. That vulnerability and acknowledging one's limitations are strengths, not weaknesses. As we packed up our fishing gear that evening, I realized that the financial devastation that had seemed insurmountable had ultimately led to something invaluable: a healthier family system with honest communication, appropriate boundaries, and genuine connection. The threat that nearly destroyed us had become the catalyst for rebuilding something stronger through Jake's intervention. My grandson had not only tracked down the stolen money, but had also shown us a path toward healing that none of the adults could see through their pain and pride. Have you ever experienced a situation where wisdom came from the most unexpected source? Has a younger family member ever surprised you with their insight or abilities? Share your experience in the comments below. And if this story about family betrayal and unexpected heroism resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to share with someone who might need to hear that sometimes our greatest challenges lead to unexpected growth. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember to take a moment to appreciate the wisdom that sometimes comes in surprising packages. Our family's journey continues, and I'm grateful every day for the grandson who taught his grandfather what true resilience looks like.